The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Grace Olatunde's Lagos mansion, casting a golden glow on the marble floors. The house was alive with the hum of activity, from the housekeeper preparing breakfast in the sprawling kitchen to the gardener tending the perfectly trimmed hedges. Grace, a poised and elegant woman in her early 40s, sat at the dining table, her eyes sparkling with pride as she gazed at her only son, David. David was everything a mother could hope for, tall, bright, and full of promise. At 18, he had just gained admission into one of Nigeria's most prestigious universities, a feat that marked the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. Grace had built her empire from nothing, rising from the dusty streets of Lagos to become a celebrated businesswoman, known far and wide for her high-quality fabrics and keen business acumen. Her success wasn't just hers. It was David's inheritance, a legacy she was determined to secure. "This is the beginning of your future, my dear," Grace said, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "I've given you everything I never had. Now it's your turn to make me proud." David grinned, his smile lighting up the room. "I will, Mama. You'll see." The week leading up to his departure was filled with preparation and celebration. Grace spared no expense in equipping David with everything he could possibly need. From state-of-the-art gadgets to a sleek car, David was set to make a grand entrance into university life. Grace's friends teased her for pampering him, but she waved off their comments with a laugh. She wanted her son to have every opportunity to succeed and make his mark. The night before David left, Grace hosted a small gathering of close friends and family. The air was filled with laughter and music as guests toasted to David's bright future. Grace watched him from across the room, her heart swelling with love. He was her everything, the reason she had fought so hard to rise above her humble beginnings. She couldn't help but remember the struggles of her youth, selling goods under the scorching sun, facing countless rejections and sleeping on cold floors. David would never know that life, and she was glad. The next morning came too quickly. As they loaded David's belongings into his car, Grace tried to hold back tears. She fussed over him, reminding him to call often and stay focused on his studies. "I'll be fine, Mama," David said, pulling her into a warm hug. "You've taught me well." Grace stood by the gate, waving as he drove off. Her heart was heavy but also full of hope. She had done everything in her power to set him on the right path. Now it was up to him. The first few weeks of David's university life were a dream. He called home regularly, sharing stories of his classes, new friends, and the excitement of living on his own. Grace listened intently, hanging on to every word. Her evenings felt brighter, knowing her son was thriving. David's updates painted a picture of joy and discovery. He described the sprawling campus with its modern architecture, the vibrant social scene, and the professors who challenged him to think in new ways. Grace couldn't have been prouder. She often bragged about him to her friends, her voice brimming with excitement. But beneath the surface of their perfect life, a subtle shift was beginning to take place. Grace noticed it first in his tone, an unfamiliar edge of impatience during their calls. Then came the missed calls and the vague responses to her questions. At first she brushed it off, convincing herself that he was simply busy with school. After all, university was a time for growth and independence. One weekend, David came home for a visit. Grace had planned a lavish dinner, eager to hear about his experiences. But when he arrived, she noticed something different about him. He seemed distracted, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. When she asked about his studies, he gave curt answers, quickly changing the subject. Grace's heart sank, but she didn't press him. She told herself he just needed time to adjust. For now, Grace held on to the memories of their last happy moments together. The laughter at his farewell party, the pride in his voice when he called her to share his accomplishments, and the warmth of his embrace as he promised to make her proud. Those memories were her anchor, a reminder of the love and joy that had defined their life together. Unbeknownst to Grace, her world was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The perfect beginning was only the calm before the storm, a fragile illusion that would soon shatter, leaving her grasping for answers in the darkness. David's arrival at the university was nothing short of spectacular. His sleek car turned heads as he drove through the gates, the hum of the engine announcing his presence. The campus buzzed with life, students laughing in clusters, professors hurrying to their lectures, and vendors selling snacks along the walkways. David was awestruck. The sprawling campus, with its modern architecture and state-of-the-art facilities, felt like a whole new world, far removed from the familiar comforts of home. As he settled into his dorm room, David couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He was finally on his own, ready to carve out his path. But he quickly realized that the university wasn't just about academics. It was a place where social status mattered, where power and influence could make or break you. David's first encounter with the elite circle happened during a casual campus event. He had been sitting alone, sipping a soda, when a group of impeccably dressed students approached him. They were confident, charismatic, and dripping with wealth. Their leader, a tall and imposing figure named Jide, extended a hand. "David, right? We've heard about you," Jide said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got potential." David felt a mix of excitement and unease. He had heard whispers about Jide and his group. They were the kingpins of campus life, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. David was flattered by their attention. Growing up, he had always wanted to belong to something bigger, to be seen and admired. Now it seemed like his chance had come. The group invited him to join them for drinks at a high-end lounge just off campus. The night was a whirlwind of laughter, expensive liquor, and stories of their escapades. David listened intently as they spoke of parties, connections, and the perks of being part of their exclusive circle. The allure was undeniable. These were the people who ran the campus, who had the money, power, and influence to open doors others couldn't even knock on. As the weeks went by, David found himself spending more time with them. They took him to the finest restaurants, introduced him to the wealthiest students, and taught him how to navigate the social ladder. First, it was thrilling. He felt like he was finally living the life he had always dreamed of. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, a tension that he couldn't quite put his finger on. One evening, during a private party at an off-campus villa, Jide pulled David aside. His tone was serious, his usual charm replaced by something colder. "You've been hanging with us for a while now, David," Jide said, his eyes boring into him. "But if you want to be one of us, you have to prove your loyalty." David's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Jide leaned in closer. "There's a group on this campus that wants to bring us down. They don't respect the hierarchy. If you want to roll with us, you'll help us show them why that's a mistake." David hesitated, his mind racing. He had heard about the rival groups, stories of fights, disappearances, and even deaths. But he never imagined he would be pulled into that world. "It's not as bad as it sounds," Jide continued, sensing David's unease. "We're a family. We look out for each other. But loyalty comes first." That night marked the beginning of David's descent. He was initiated into their secret society, swearing an oath of allegiance. The ceremony was dark and ritualistic, a far cry from the glamorous life he had been introduced to. He felt a knot in his stomach as he repeated the words, binding himself to a world he barely understood. The following days were a blur. David was drawn into their plans, participating in intimidation tactics against rival groups and running errands that left him feeling more like a pawn than a member of an elite circle. But every time he questioned his choices, Jide reminded him of the benefits: protection, power, and access to opportunities that others could only dream of. Back home, Grace noticed the change in David's tone during their calls. He was less talkative, his once vibrant energy replaced by a guardedness she couldn't quite understand. She chalked it up to the pressures of university life, reassuring herself that he was just adjusting to his new environment. One weekend, David skipped his usual trip home, claiming he had too much schoolwork. In reality, he was at a meeting with the group, plotting their next move against a rival cult. The tension on campus was escalating, with clashes breaking out in the dead of night and whispers of revenge spreading like wildfire. David was in over his head, but he didn't know how to get out. He felt trapped, bound by the oath he had taken and the fear of what might happen if he tried to leave. The turning point came when David received a message from his mother, asking when he would visit. Her words were filled with love and longing, a stark contrast to the cold and dangerous world he had become a part of. For a brief moment he considered confiding in her, telling her everything. But the thought of her disappointment and the consequences of his actions kept him silent. Instead, he replied with a simple text, "I'll come home soon, Mama. Don't worry." But deep down, David knew that his world was spiraling out of control, and the boy who had once left home full of hope and dreams was slowly fading away. David's life spiraled further into a world he no longer recognized. The campus, once a place of opportunity and excitement, had turned into a battlefield, with rival cult groups constantly vying for dominance. It was no longer about prestige or camaraderie, it was about survival. The secret society David had pledged his loyalty to demanded more from him each day. At first it was small tasks, delivering messages, attending clandestine meetings and standing guard during late-night confrontations. But soon he was drawn deeper into their operations, forced to participate in acts that left him sleepless and haunted. The lines between right and wrong blurred, replaced by the harsh reality of power and control. One evening, Jide summoned the group to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of campus. The air was thick with tension as David joined the others, their faces illuminated by the dim light of a single bulb. Jide's usual charisma was gone, replaced by a steely determination. "We've been disrespected," Jide announced, his voice echoing off the walls. "The Black Vipers crossed a line, and they need to be reminded who runs this campus." David's heart sank. The Black Vipers were the most notorious rival cult on campus, known for their brutality and willingness to go to any lengths to protect their territory. The thought of crossing them sent a chill down his spine. Jide turned to David, his gaze piercing. "You're going to lead the message this time, David. It's time you show us what you're made of." David's stomach churned. He wanted to protest, to explain that he had joined for protection, not to become a pawn in their violent games. But he knew better than to defy Jide. The consequences of disobedience were as severe as the acts they were being asked to carry out. That night, David found himself standing outside the gates of the rival cult's hideout, a crude warning message in his hand. His hands trembled as he placed it where it would be found, knowing the retaliation it would provoke. As he walked away, his heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Back in Lagos, Grace's unease grew with each passing day. David's calls had become sporadic, his voice distant and strained. When he did visit, he seemed distracted, his once bright eyes clouded with something she couldn't identify. She noticed the subtle changes, how he avoided direct eye contact, how he flinched at sudden noises, how his hands trembled ever so slightly when he thought no one was looking. One afternoon she decided to visit him unannounced. She drove to the campus, her heart heavy with worry. When she arrived, David was nowhere to be found. His roommates were evasive, their nervous glances only fueling her suspicions. Determined to get answers, she left a message for him, asking him to call her immediately. That evening, David returned to his dorm to find his mother's note. Panic gripped him. He couldn't let her see the life he was living, the choices he had made. He called her, putting on his best attempt at a cheerful tone. "Mama, I'm so sorry I wasn't around," he said, his voice strained. "I've been swamped with assignments. I'll visit soon, I promise." Grace wasn't convinced. "David, is everything all right? You sound different." "I'm fine, Mama. Just tired." But Grace knew her son. She could hear the unspoken words in his voice, the pain he was trying to hide. She decided to give him space, hoping he would open up to her in time. But the nagging feeling in her chest refused to go away. As tensions on campus escalated, the rival cults began clashing more frequently. Students were caught in the crossfire, with stories of assaults and disappearances spreading like wildfire. The administration turned a blind eye, too afraid to confront the powerful forces at play. David's group was no exception. Jide's demands became more ruthless, pushing David further into the depths of the cult's operations. The violence weighed heavily on him, each act chipping away at the person he used to be. He started avoiding calls from Grace altogether, unable to face her knowing the person he was becoming. One night, after a particularly brutal confrontation with the Black Vipers, David sat alone in his dorm room, his hands stained with the evidence of his actions. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The boy who had once dreamed of a bright future was gone, replaced by someone he didn't know, someone he didn't want to be. But leaving wasn't an option. The cult's rules were clear. Once you were in, there was no way out. Betrayal was met with swift and brutal punishment. David was trapped, bound by fear and the blood-soaked oaths he had sworn. Grace's unease turned into desperation. Unable to ignore the signs any longer, she began investigating. She called David's friends, visited the campus more frequently, and even spoke to his professors. but no one had answers. It was as if David was slipping through her fingers, disappearing into a shadowy world she couldn't reach. One day she overheard a conversation between two students at a campus cafe. They spoke in hushed tones about the escalating violence, the secret societies, and the boys who got caught up in it all. Grace's blood ran cold as she pieced together the fragments of their conversation. Could David be involved in something like that? She refused to believe it. Her David was a good boy raised with love and discipline. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with every passing day. Grace decided to confront him directly. She waited until his next visit home, determined to get the truth. But when David arrived, his demeanor only confirmed her worst fears. He was jumpy, his eyes darting around as if expecting danger at every corner. When she asked him what was wrong, he brushed her off, claiming he was just tired from school. But Grace wasn't convinced. She pressed him further, her voice breaking with emotion. "David, please talk to me. I know something is wrong. Let me help you." David looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and pain. For a brief moment he considered telling her everything. But the thought of her disappointment, of the danger it would put her in, kept him silent. "I'm fine, Mama," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry about me." But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her son was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. The descent into chaos had begun, and neither of them could see the storm that lay ahead. The campus had become a war zone. The once bustling walkways were now deserted after dark, as students feared being caught in the crossfire of rival cult clashes. The air was thick with tension, and whispers of revenge filled every corner of the university. David was no longer the carefree boy who had driven through the gates with dreams of a bright future. He was a shadow of himself, haunted by the choices he had made and the blood he had seen spilled. David's loyalty to Jiday's group had come at a steep cost. His once promising academic performance had plummeted, replaced by a constant state of fear and paranoia. The cult's demands had grown increasingly dangerous, leaving no room for hesitation or doubt. David was no longer an observer. He was a participant, entangled in a web of violence that threatened to consume him. One night, Jiday called for an emergency meeting. The Black Vipers had struck again, ambushing one of their members in broad daylight. The attack had been brutal, sending a clear message: no one was safe. The group gathered in a secluded location, their faces grim as Jiday laid out the plan for retaliation. "This is our chance to show them who's in charge," Jiday said, his voice cold and commanding. "David, you're with me." David's heart sank. He had avoided direct involvement in the most violent confrontations, but there was no escaping this time. Jiday's eyes bore into him, leaving no room for refusal. The others nodded in agreement, their silence a testament to the fear Jiday commanded. That night, David found himself crouched behind a wall, clutching a weapon he didn't want to use. The rival group's hideout loomed ahead, its darkened windows a stark reminder of what lay inside. The plan was simple: storm the hideout, send a message, and leave before anyone could retaliate. But nothing went according to plan. The Vipers were waiting, armed and ready. The confrontation that followed was chaotic and brutal, a blur of shouts, gunfire, and panic. David barely escaped, his body trembling as he stumbled back to his dorm room. The images of the night replayed in his mind, each one more horrifying than the last. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. Back in Lagos, Grace's worry had turned into full-blown panic. The rumors she had overheard about cult activities on campus seemed to align with David's behavior. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Determined to get answers, she drove to the university unannounced. She found David in his dorm room, slumped on the edge of his bed. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. The sight broke her heart. This wasn't her son. This was a boy drowning in something far beyond his control. "David," she said softly, stepping into the room. "What's going on? Please talk to me." David looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and despair. For a moment he considered opening up, telling her everything. But the weight of his choices, and the consequences they carried, kept him silent. "Mama, I'm fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to worry." Grace knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "I'm your mother, David. I can see that something is wrong. Whatever it is, we can face it together. But you have to let me in." Tears welled in David's eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. "I can't, Mama. You wouldn't understand." "Then help me understand," Grace pleaded. "You're not alone, David. Please don't shut me out." But David shook his head, pulling his hands away. "It's better this way, Mama. Just trust me." Grace left that night with a heavy heart. She had tried to reach him, to break through the walls he had built around himself, but it was clear he wasn't ready to let her in. All she could do was pray that he would find his way back to her. David's world came crashing down on a fateful night. Jiday's group had planned another retaliation, determined to assert their dominance. David, unwilling but unable to refuse, was once again thrust into the middle of the chaos. The ambush happened as they were returning to their hideout. The Vipers had been lying in wait, their numbers overwhelming. The attack was swift and merciless, leaving no room for escape. David fought desperately, his heart pounding as he tried to find a way out. But the Vipers were relentless, their revenge brutal and unforgiving. As he lay on the ground, injured and helpless, David's mind flashed back to his mother. He thought of her smile, her laughter, the way she had always believed in him. The weight of his choices crushed him, filling him with regret. He had let her down, and now he would never have the chance to make it right. The call came in the early hours of the morning. Grace was asleep when her phone rang, the sound jarring her awake. She answered groggily, but the words on the other end of the line sent a chill through her body. "Mrs. Olatunde, this is the university. There's been an incident involving your son." Grace's heart stopped. "What happened? Is he all right?" There was a pause, then the dreaded words, "We're sorry. David didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt as Grace's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the phone, her mind refusing to process the words. Her son, her pride, her joy, was gone. In the days that followed, the truth began to unravel. The details of David's involvement in the cult, the violence he had been a part of, and the events leading up to his death came to light. Grace was devastated. She had fought so hard to give him a better life, but it had all been taken away in an instant. David's death marked the breaking point for Grace. The trust she had in the world, in the system, in the future she had worked so hard to build was shattered. The perfect life she had created had crumbled, leaving her with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Grace sat alone in the grand living room of her mansion, the silence weighing heavily on her. The house that once echoed with laughter and joy now felt cold and empty. Framed photos of David smiled down at her from the walls, reminders of the boy she had loved so deeply and lost so tragically. She clutched one of them, her tears soaking the glass. Her son was gone, but the pain of his death was compounded by the truth she had uncovered in its wake. David had been drawn into a world of darkness, a world she had fought so hard to shield him from. She couldn't understand how it had happened. She had given him everything: love, guidance, opportunity. How had it all gone so wrong? The university's dark underbelly was thrust into the spotlight following David's death. Investigations revealed the extent of the cult activities that had plagued the campus for years. Stories of violence, extortion, and intimidation came to light, shocking parents and students alike. The administration's failure to address the problem became a point of outrage, with many accusing them of turning a blind eye to the danger. Grace attended the meetings and protests, her grief driving her to demand answers. She wanted justice for David, for every student who had been caught in the same web of deceit and destruction. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the university's promises of reform were little more than empty words. The authorities arrested several members of the rival cult, but Jiday and many of his followers vanished without a trace. Rumors swirled that they had fled the country, their connections and wealth shielding them from accountability. The knowledge that those responsible for her son's death might never face justice only deepened Grace's pain. Grief consumed Grace, leaving her a shell of the woman she once was. She stopped attending her business meetings, her thriving empire left in the hands of her managers. Her days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. She would sit in David's room for hours, surrounded by his belongings, searching for some sense of connection to the boy she had lost. One day, as she was sorting through his things, she found a journal tucked under his mattress. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the pages filled with David's neat handwriting. The entries started off light-hearted, recounting his early days at the university and his excitement about the future. But as she read on, the tone shifted. David wrote about his struggles, his fear of disappointing her, and the pressure to fit in. He wrote about Jide and the group, about the oaths he had taken and the things he had seen. The last entry was dated just days before his death. I wish I could tell Mama the truth. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to get out. Grace clutched the journal to her chest, her sobs echoing through the empty room. She had failed to see the pain her son was in, failed to save him from the darkness that had consumed him. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the love she felt for him. She knew he had been a victim, pulled into something far beyond his control. Determined to honor David's memory, Grace channeled her grief into action. She launched a foundation in his name, dedicated to combating cult activities and providing support for students at risk. The foundation worked with schools and universities, offering counseling services, awareness campaigns, and resources to help students navigate the pressures of campus life. Grace became a vocal advocate, sharing David's story at conferences and seminars. She spoke about the dangers of secrecy, the importance of communication, and the need for parents to remain vigilant. Her words resonated with many, sparking a national conversation about the hidden dangers lurking within Nigeria's educational institutions. Despite her efforts, the pain of losing David never left her. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the empty seat at the dining table, in the sound of his laughter that echoed in her mind. But her work gave her purpose, a way to keep his memory alive and prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak. In her journey for justice and change, Grace learned a harsh truth. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. It comes from the systems that fail to protect, from the silence of those who look the other way, from the greed of those who prioritize power over lives. The betrayal of the university, of the authorities, and even of David's peers weighed heavily on her, leaving scars that would never fully heal. But the deepest betrayal, she realized, was the one David had inflicted on himself. He had betrayed his own potential, his own dreams, in his pursuit of belonging and acceptance. And yet Grace couldn't bring herself to blame him entirely. He had been a boy lost in a world that preyed on the vulnerable, a world that demanded too much and gave too little in return. Years later, Grace stood at the opening ceremony of a new youth center funded by her foundation. The center was named David Olatunde House, a tribute to the boy who had inspired it all. As she cut the ribbon, surrounded by students and families, she felt a glimmer of hope. David's story would not be forgotten. His life, though tragically short, had sparked a movement that would save others. As the crowd cheered, Grace looked up at the sky, her heart heavy but full of love. She knew David was watching over her, his spirit guiding her in her mission. She had lost her son, but she had found a way to honor his memory, to turn her pain into something meaningful. And though the scars of betrayal and loss would always remain, Grace held on to the belief that love and resilience could create a legacy that would outlive the darkness. David's story was one of heartbreak, but also of hope, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, light could still shine through.